Tulsa, Oklahoma. November 1954. The detective had been doing this for 22 years. He had sat across from murderers and robbers and men who had done things that still found him in the small hours. He thought he knew how to read a room. Then he asked Nannie Doss how her fifth husband had died, and she laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not the kind that escapes under pressure and embarrasses the person it escapes from. A genuine laugh, warm and unguarded, the kind you hear from someone who has just been reminded of something fond. She covered her mouth with one hand the way polite women do, and her shoulders shook, and when she looked back up at him her eyes were bright. She was 50 years old. She had grey-streaked hair pinned back from a round and pleasant face. She was wearing a house dress. She looked like someone's grandmother, which she was. She looked like someone who baked on Sundays and kept her garden tidy and sent birthday cards on time, which she also was. She had just confessed to poisoning her husband Samuel Doss with arsenic-laced prune juice 2 weeks earlier. She would confess to 4 more murders before the week was out. And through every session, every question, every piece of evidence carefully laid on the table between them, she remained warm. Cooperative. Occasionally, at moments when warmth and cooperation were the last things anyone expected, she laughed. The detective wrote in his report that evening that in 22 years he had never encountered anything like it. He did not mean the murders. He meant the laugh. This is the story of Nannie Doss. Of 11 people dead across 3 decades. Of a woman who killed with patience and domesticity and a cheerfulness that none of the investigators, psychiatrists, or journalists who studied her ever adequately explained. And of the question that her laugh left behind in that interrogation room, still sitting there long after she was gone. Whether she found it funny. And if so, what exactly it was she found amusing. Before we go further, if you found this through the algorithm and you're still here, there's a good chance you've watched something from this channel before without realizing it. Check now whether you're subscribed to Glen. Most people aren't. It takes 1 second and it means the next story finds you instead of you having to go looking for it. Nancy Hazel was born on November 4, 1905, in Blue Mountain, Alabama, the second of 5 children. Her father, James Hazel, farmed cotton on land that returned just enough to keep the family fed and not enough to keep them comfortable. He was, by every account that survives, a man of rigid temperament who ran his household without warmth and without discussion. Decisions belonged to him. The children worked. The women cooked and kept quiet. It was not, by the standards of rural Alabama in 1905, an unusual household. It was simply the world as it had been arranged. What distinguished James Hazel from other rigid fathers of his time and place was the particular degree of his control over his daughters. He did not permit them to socialize freely. He did not permit them to attend dances without his direct supervision. He did not permit Nancy, who had taken to calling herself Nanny, which was warmer, which suited her, to keep company with boys unless he had approved the arrangement in advance. She was bright and sociable by temperament, and the confinement produced in her a specific hunger. A hunger for the version of life that existed in the romance magazines. She found them early, sometime around 1918, when she was 12 or 13. The pulp publications of that era, True Story, Modern Romance, the Lonely Hearts columns tucked into the back pages of women's weeklies, described love as a transforming force. Marriage as a rival. The right man as the answer to everything that was wrong. Nannie had no experience against which to test these ideas. She had no access to marriages that were ordinary rather than extraordinary, no sense of the gap between the magazine's version and the actual texture of domestic life. She believed what she read completely, the way children believe what they are told, and the belief did not loosen as she aged. It calcified instead. When she was 16, a boy named Charlie Braggs asked her father for permission to court her. James Hazel said yes. Braggs came from a family with slightly more land than his own, which may have been the calculation. Nannie had met him twice. She married him 4 months later, in 1921, convinced that she was finally entering the life the magazines had described. She was not. The marriage to Charlie Braggs lasted from 1921 to 1927 and produced 4 children. From the first year, it bore no resemblance to anything Nannie had read about. Braggs drank heavily and consistently. He was unfaithful without discretion, bringing other women into the social orbit of the marriage in ways that were visible to neighbors and family. On at least one occasion, by Nannie's later account, he brought another woman into the house while Nannie was present, and when she objected, he told her to be quiet. His mother lived with them for extended periods and dominated the household in ways that left Nannie with no authority over her own kitchen, her own schedule, or her own children. The romance magazines had not described mothers-in-law. They had not described drunkenness or infidelity or the specific humiliation of being overruled in your own home by a woman who was not your mother. They had described love, and Nannie had married expecting love, and what she had found instead was a set of arrangements in which she was the least important person. She endured it. She cooked and cleaned and raised the children and read her magazines when she could find a quiet moment, and she endured it, because there was no alternative she could see. Women of her background in 1920s Alabama did not leave their husbands. They did not have independent income. They did not have legal mechanisms easily available to them. They stayed, and they managed, and they waited for something to change. What changed, in 1927, was that 2 of her 4 children died. They were both under 3 years old. The recorded cause of death on both certificates was gastroenteritis. Infant mortality in rural Alabama in 1927 was common enough that 2 children dying of stomach illness attracted no particular scrutiny from anyone outside the family. They were buried in the local churchyard. The paperwork was filed. No one looked twice. Charlie Braggs looked once, and it was enough. He could not have articulated what he saw. He told investigators, decades later, that something in the way Nannie had behaved around the sick children had frightened him in a way he had no language for. Something in her composure. Something in the quality of her attention. He took the 2 surviving children and left, which was itself a significant act for a man of his time and background. Leaving your wife and taking the children required a conviction that most people in his community would not have shared or supported. He left anyway. Nannie raised no objection. She let him go. The 2 dead children's certificates list gastroenteritis as cause of death. The symptoms described in the attending physician's notes, vomiting, abdominal cramping, rapid deterioration, death within days, are consistent with arsenic poisoning. They are also consistent with legitimate gastroenteritis, which killed thousands of young children every year in that era. Without exhumation and forensic testing, certainty is impossible. What can be said is that Charlie Braggs was frightened enough to leave, and that Nannie showed no visible grief at his departure, and that the 2 children were the first in a pattern that would not become visible for 27 more years. After Braggs left, Nannie turned to the Lonely Hearts columns with the seriousness of someone conducting a search. She was 22 years old, had 2 surviving children from her first marriage, no independent income, and a belief system, inherited from the magazines and reinforced by nothing in her actual experience, that the right man was still out there and that marriage to him would produce the life she had been promised. She found Frank Harrelson through the columns. They corresponded for 2 years before meeting, which was longer than most Lonely Hearts arrangements of that era. The letters she sent him were warm and detailed and funny in places. She had a gift for the kind of domestic observation that makes everyday life feel significant, for noticing the small texture of things in a way that makes the reader feel they are there with her. Harrelson responded with increasing enthusiasm. He thought he was corresponding with a woman who understood how to make a home into something worth returning to. He was not entirely wrong about that. Nannie did understand this. She was a genuinely good cook, by all accounts that survive, in the way that people who grew up with nothing and learned to make food out of whatever was available often become good cooks. She kept a tidy house. She was warm with neighbors and attentive to community obligations, the church bake sales, the neighborhood associations, the informal networks of mutual aid that structured small-town southern life. She was the kind of woman who was called a good neighbor, and she was, by every external measure, exactly that. She and Harrelson married in 1929. He was pleasant enough when sober. When drinking, which was often, he was a different person, loud and unpredictable, and on occasion violent. The police records from Anniston, Alabama, where they lived in the early 1930s, include a domestic disturbance call to the Harrelson address. No charges were filed. The attending officer noted bruising on the wife. This was the standard outcome of such calls. The officer noted it and moved on, because in 1932 in Alabama there was nothing else to do. Nannie endured the marriage for 16 years. She had another child by Harrelson, a daughter. She kept the house clean and the garden tidy and the food on the table and the neighbors happy. She went to church. She read her magazines. And somewhere in those 16 years, in a process that left no documentary record and produced no witnesses, she arrived at a decision. In 1945, she put arsenic in Frank Harrelson's whiskey. He died that evening. The death was attributed to alcohol poisoning, which was not an unreasonable attribution. He had been a heavy drinker for decades, and his liver was in the condition that decades of heavy drinking produce. The doctor signed the certificate without requesting an autopsy. He had seen this before. He expected to see it again. Nannie collected the life insurance policy, which was modest, a few $100s, and turned again to the columns. What the 16 years between the marriage and the arsenic contained is the important question, and it is one that the records cannot fully answer. What they suggest is a woman engaged in a long and private process of calculation. The arsenic she used had to be obtained. It was available commercially, sold in hardware stores as rat poison, and no one tracked its purchase or questioned a woman buying it. But it had to be measured, and the measurement had to be right, enough to be lethal, not so much as to produce immediate visible symptoms that would raise questions. She had thought about it. She had been thinking about it, in all likelihood, for years before she acted. This is the element of Nannie Doss's story that the press coverage of 1954 preferred to avoid, because it complicates the comfortable picture of impulsive domestic madness. She was not impulsive. She was not frenzied. She was not, in any conventional sense, out of control. She was a woman who had developed, over 16 years of limited options and repeated disappointment, a very specific solution to a very specific problem. And she applied it with the same steady patience she applied to everything else in her domestic life. She was 40 years old when Frank Harrelson died. She had been married for 24 years across 2 marriages, and neither marriage had produced the life she was looking for. She did not appear to consider giving up on marriage. She appeared to consider, instead, whether she had been choosing the wrong men, and how to avoid making that mistake again. The third husband was Arlie Lanning, found through the columns in 1947. He was from Lexington, North Carolina, and the correspondence between them before the marriage was extensive. He presented well on paper. He had a steady job, owned his own home, wrote with apparent sincerity about wanting a companion for the second half of his life. Nannie moved to North Carolina with her daughter from the Harrelson marriage and settled into the Lanning household with the efficiency she brought to all domestic transitions. Lanning drank. This emerged within the first months of the marriage and deepened over the following years. He was not violent in the way Harrelson had been, but he was unreliable and frequently absent, spending evenings at the local establishments rather than at home, and he was unfaithful in the quiet way of a man who does not make much effort to conceal it because he does not think his wife has any recourse. He was not entirely wrong about that. She had moved across state lines to marry him. She had no independent income. She had, once again, arrived at the wrong man. While the marriage was deteriorating, 2 additional people came to stay with Nannie. Lanning's mother, who was elderly and required care, moved into the house in 1949. She died within months. The death was attributed to heart failure, which was not implausible for an elderly woman. Then a nephew of Nannie's came to visit. He was a young child. He became ill during the visit and died. The cause recorded was a digestive complaint. These deaths were not investigated. They occurred in the context of a household that was otherwise unremarkable, tended by a woman who was known in the community as warm and capable. The deaths were sad. They were also, in the context of the 1940s and early 1950s, not unusual enough to demand explanation beyond what the attending doctors provided. Arlie Lanning died in 1952 of what was recorded as heart failure. He was in his 50s, had been a drinker for decades, and showed no signs of poisoning that the examining doctor was looking for, because the examining doctor was not looking for poisoning. His mother had died in this house. His nephew had died in this house. Arlie had died in this house. 3 deaths in 3 years, all attributed to natural causes, all accepted without question by a medical and legal system that was not designed to see a pattern that crossed family lines and years. Nannie inherited Lanning's house and a small insurance payment. Before she left Lexington, The house burned to the ground. The cause of the fire was never formally established. She collected the fire insurance. She was back at the columns within months. The fourth husband was Richard Morton, found in 1952, married the same year. He was from Emporia, Kansas, and was the most presentable of her husbands in terms of surface characteristics. Employed, non-violent, reasonably clean in his habits. He was also unfaithful almost immediately, and openly, in the way of a man who considers fidelity an optional feature of marriage rather than a condition of it. Nannie's mother, Lou Hazel, came to visit in 1953. She stayed for several months. She became ill and died. The cause of death was recorded as a stomach ailment. Nannie's sister Dovey came to visit shortly after their mother's death. Dovey became ill and died as well, of similar symptoms, recorded similarly. A mother, a sister, a nephew. These deaths fall outside the framework of disappointed marriage, which is the framework the press and the prosecution and the public all preferred for Nannie Doss, because it is the most legible one. A woman who kills bad husbands occupies a comprehensible, if terrible, position in the moral imagination. A woman who kills her mother and her sister occupies a different position, one that the mind resists approaching directly. Nannie's prison interviews address these deaths obliquely. She does not deny them. She does not elaborate on them much either, deflecting with the same pleasant vagueness she deployed for everything that made her interrogators uncomfortable. What emerges, reading between the careful lines of the psychiatric evaluations, is the suggestion that by this point in her life, death had become for Nannie a relatively straightforward response to a relatively broad category of problems. People who were burdensome. People who had disappointed her. People whose presence was inconvenient or whose needs exceeded what she was willing to provide. The method was available. It was reliable. It was undetectable. She used it. Richard Morton died in late 1953, of stomach illness. Nannie had been married to him for approximately a year. The death was recorded and accepted. She collected the insurance. She was back at the columns almost immediately. The fifth husband was Samuel Doss, found in 1953 and married the same year. He was a retired civil servant living in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and he was, by all available accounts, a genuinely decent man. He did not drink. He was not unfaithful. He was not violent. He paid his bills and kept his word, and by the external measures of his community was considered a solid and reliable person. He was also, in Nannie's daily experience, profoundly controlling in a way that registered differently than the control she had known before. He was not cruel. He was principled, which is a different thing but can produce the same results in practice. He disapproved of her television viewing, which he considered a waste of time and a corrupting influence. He disapproved of her romance magazines, which he found frivolous and possibly indecent. He disapproved of the time she spent on her correspondence, which he felt was not an appropriate activity for a married woman. He wanted her to be more serious, more austere, more focused on the practical and the godly. He was trying, in other words, to make her into something she was not. And Nannie Doss had spent her entire adult life being made into things by men, contained by her father, humiliated by Braggs, bruised by Harrelson, cheated on by Lanning and Morton. She had developed, by 1954, a reliable remedy for men who required more from her than she was willing to give. In September 1954, she put arsenic in Samuel's coffee. He became violently ill. He was hospitalized, treated, and spent several weeks recovering before being discharged. He came home. He resumed his mild disapprovals. He regulated her television and her magazines and her correspondence. In October 1954, she stewed prunes and laced them with arsenic. He ate them on October 4th. He died on October 5th. The doctor who had treated Samuel during his September hospitalization attended his death and was immediately uneasy. The symptoms were too familiar. The timeline was wrong for a natural recurrence. He requested an autopsy, which was unusual enough in Tulsa in 1954 to require explanation, and he provided one. Something about this death did not sit right with him. He could not have said exactly what. Something. The autopsy found arsenic in quantities sufficient to remove all ambiguity. Samuel Doss had been poisoned. The analysis was unambiguous. The detective was called. Nannie was brought in. And she laughed. The confession that followed was conducted over several days. Nannie was cooperative throughout, answering questions with apparent honesty, occasionally correcting the detectives when she thought they had a detail wrong, occasionally volunteering information they had not asked for. She confessed to Samuel. She confessed to Morton. She confessed to Lanning. She confessed to Harrelson. When pressed about her mother, her sister, her nephew, she was less explicit but not denying. She confirmed enough that the investigators understood the scope of what they were dealing with, even if the confirmations were hedged and partial. What she would not provide, through any of the sessions, was a conventional expression of remorse. She said she was sorry about Samuel, because he had not been as bad as the others. That word, bad, appeared several times in the transcripts, always in relation to the husbands, always used as if it were a measurable quality against which her response had been calibrated. Harrelson had been bad. Morton had been bad. Lanning had been bad. Samuel had been less bad, and she was correspondingly more sorry about him, but not sorry in a way that reached the conventional depth of the emotion. The detective asked her, at one point, whether she felt guilty. She thought about it genuinely, in the way of someone who is actually consulting their interior state rather than performing the consultation. She said she supposed she felt bad about some of it. She said she wished things had been different. She said she had always believed the right man was out there, and she had not found him, and she was sorry about that. She was sorry about not finding the right man. The 11 people were, in this formulation, incidental to the central disappointment. The exhumations began immediately. Samuel first, then Morton, then Lanning, then Harrelson. Each body returned arsenic levels that established poisoning conclusively. The cause of death on each original certificate was wrong. The doctors who had signed those certificates had not been negligent by the standards of their time. They had seen what they expected to see, sick men dying of the things that sick men die of, because the woman who survived each of these men was a widow, and widows were offered condolences, not scrutiny. The investigation that radiated outward from Tulsa in late 1954 was attempting to reconstruct 30 years of activity across 4 states with records that were incomplete, in jurisdictions that were not designed to communicate with each other, in an era before any mechanism existed for correlating patterns across distances. What it found was what the exhumations confirmed, a minimum of 5 poisonings, with strong circumstantial evidence for 6 more, and the possibility of additional deaths that could not be forensically established. The 2 Bragg's children who had died in 1927 could not be exhumed, the graves had not been maintained, and the records of their precise location were insufficient for recovery. The nephew who had died in Nannie's care in the 1930s was similarly unrecoverable. The deaths of Nannie's mother and sister were confirmed through exhumation to have involved arsenic, adding them to the formal tally. The neighbor in North Carolina who had died during Nannie's time there was investigated but produced insufficient evidence for inclusion in the charges. The final confirmed count was 11. The investigators believed the actual number was higher, possibly significantly higher. They could not prove it to the standard required for prosecution, and the prosecution did not attempt the full count. Nannie Doss was charged with the murder of Samuel Doss only, on the grounds that the clearest case with the most recent forensic evidence was the most reliable vehicle for a conviction. She pleaded guilty. She was sentenced to life imprisonment in June 1955. The courtroom was quiet during the sentencing. Nannie said she was sorry for what she had done. She said it in the same tone she used for everything, which was pleasant and unhurried, and the judge thanked her for her cooperation, and it was over. She was taken to the Oklahoma State Penitentiary at McAllister. She was given a cell. She was given access to magazines, which she read consistently throughout her imprisonment. She gave interviews from prison. She was cooperative, friendly, apparently pleased to have visitors. She talked about her love of cooking. She talked about the romance magazines. She maintained, through all of it, that she had believed in marriage and had been disappointed by it, and that she continued to believe in it in the abstract, which she did not appear to find contradictory. She had been corresponding, at the time of her arrest, with a man through the columns. She told one interviewer that she thought he might have been the right one. She said this without irony, without apparent awareness of its absurdity. She had spent 30 years and 11 lives in the pursuit of the marriage the magazines described, and she remained, in the most literal sense available, an optimist. The press named her the Giggling Granny. They named her the Jolly Black Widow. They found the incongruity irresistible, the comfortable grandmother, the warm laugh, the extraordinary body count, and they rendered it as a kind of grotesque comedy, because grotesque comedy was the only available container for something that would not fit anywhere the culture had prepared for it. The coverage was extensive and almost uniformly superficial. It was interested in the laugh. It was not particularly interested in the question behind the laugh. The psychiatric evaluations that were conducted after her arrest are more careful. They describe a woman of average intelligence who showed no signs of psychosis, no delusional thinking, no disconnection from reality. She was cooperative throughout, which the evaluators found itself notable. She understood what she had done. She understood that it was wrong in the eyes of the law. She engaged coherently with every question, tracked the logic of the interviews, showed no signs of confusion or dissociation in the clinical sense of those terms. What the evaluators could not account for was the flatness of her emotional response to the deaths. Not absence of emotion. She had emotions, clearly, about the marriages and the disappointments and the gap between the life she had wanted and the one she had lived. But the deaths themselves seemed to occupy a different register in her interior life than they occupied in anyone else's. They were events she had caused, which she acknowledged. They were events that had consequences, which she also acknowledged. They were not, apparently, events that she returned to in the night or that troubled her sleep or that produced in her anything resembling what the evaluators recognized as guilt. The word they used, carefully, was dissociation. Not in the clinical sense of a fractured self. In a narrower sense, that for Nannie Doss, the act of poisoning someone and the emotional weight that the act carried for other people had been somehow separated. The act was a tool. It solved a problem. It was put away when the problem was solved. The weight that the act should have carried, the weight of a human life, the weight of a family left behind, the weight of a child's future removed, that weight did not land on Nannie in the way it lands on most people. Why it did not land is a question the evaluators could not answer. They noted her childhood. They noted the father's control, the early marriage, the series of abusive and disappointing relationships. They noted the absence of any adult relationship that had modeled warmth or mutuality or the kind of love the magazines described. They noted that she had been contained and overruled and bruised and cheated on and diminished for the entirety of her adult life, by men and by a culture that gave her no exit and no recourse, and that she had developed, in that context, a solution. They did not say the solution was understandable. They did not say it was justified. They said it was produced by something, and that the something was worth noting. Nannie Doss developed leukemia in prison. She died on June 2, 1965, at the age of 59, having served 10 years of her life sentence. She was buried in the prison cemetery at McAllister in a grave that went unmarked for many years. The romance magazines had long since changed. The Lonely Hearts columns still existed in various forms, though the culture around them was shifting. The world she had operated in, the world of small unconnected insurance policies and uncoordinated death records and women who were not suspects, was beginning, slowly, to change. Better record keeping. Better communication between jurisdictions. A growing, if still limited, awareness among medical professionals that patterns of death around a single individual warranted scrutiny. Whether Nannie Doss would have continued to operate undetected in a later era is an interesting question with no certain answer. She was adaptive. She was patient. She understood, intuitively, that the systems around her were not designed to look for what she was doing, and she operated in the gaps those systems created. She might have found the gaps in a later system. She might not have. What she would not have found, in any version of any life she was likely to have, is the marriage the magazines described. The right man. The transforming love. The domestic sanctuary that made everything that came before it worthwhile. That man did not exist for her, or if he existed somewhere, he did not find his way to her columns. She had been looking for him for 30 years. She had tried 5 times. She had removed, one by one, the men who were not him. She had remained, through all of it, convinced that the next one might be. The detective who first interviewed her retired in 1961. In an interview given to a local newspaper on the occasion of his retirement, he was asked what case had stayed with him most over 22 years. He said Nannie Doss without hesitation. Not because of the numbers, he said. Because of the laugh. He had spent years trying to understand what she found funny, and he had never arrived at an answer that satisfied him. The answer, if there is one, is probably this. She laughed because the question was, to her, almost innocent in its unawareness. How had her husband died? As if she were expected to pretend she didn't know. As if the whole arrangement, the marrying and the hoping and the poisoning and the starting over, was not simply how things had gone. As if everyone in that room could not see, if they were honest about it, that this was the shape her life had taken. That she had wanted something the world would not give her, and she had found her own way to manage the men who stood between her and it, and here they all were now, sitting across a table in Tulsa, having apparently only just worked this out. She was not laughing at the deaths. She was not laughing at the detective. She was laughing, perhaps, at the gap. The gap between the life the magazines had promised and the life she had actually lived. The gap between what she had hoped for and what she had found. The gap between what everyone in that room thought a grandmother looked like and what she actually was. That gap had been the central fact of her existence for 50 years. She had spent those 50 years sitting inside it, reading her magazines, cooking her food, tending her garden, and occasionally, with patience and precision and a steady domestic hand, poisoning someone. She found it funny. Maybe because it was. Maybe because the alternative was something she had already exhausted. In the morning after her first full confession, Nannie Doss asked the officer on duty if she could have a magazine. He brought her a women's publication, a recipe and household tips magazine, not the romance pulp she preferred, but something. She sat and read it for an hour before her attorney arrived. The officer who brought it told a reporter later that she seemed entirely absorbed. Comfortable. At home. That image is the one that stays. The woman reading her magazine in the Tulsa police station, having just confessed to multiple murders, entirely at ease. Not performing ease. Actually at ease. As if the previous day had been a difficult but necessary administrative matter and was now concluded, and she could return to the things she found meaningful. She had wanted a particular life. She had not been given it. She had managed as best she could with the life she had been given instead. The magazine was full of recipes. She read them carefully, the way she read everything. Looking, perhaps, for something worth making. Something that might, this time, turn out right. If you like this story, check out the ones on your screen. The dark algorithm thinks you'll enjoy these too.